Uh, this is a wonderful course that we've had focusing on confronting modern humanism and Jewish thought, led by Professor Yossi Turner. And we've come a long way. We've addressed issues dealing with emancipation of the Jews, the turn towards human focus from God focus of Jewish thought and religion, particularly among academics, how humanism affect the development of Zionism. And today we're going to be taking a look at a new way of looking at Jewish religion and the Torah as religious constitution, according to Rabbi Chaim Hershenson. So, Professor Turner, could you?
Terrific. Thank you very much. Happy holiday, whether it's Passover, Easter, or I imagine there are other holidays around now that I also don't have in my mind at the moment. So happy holiday. That's the reason that I'm not in person. And I'm right now upstate New York because I was with my brother for the holiday. I also want to remind you, since now we're all on Zoom, at least for this session, I welcome comments and questions even during the presentation, not necessarily only at the end. Using Zoom may be the best way to do it if anybody has something to say. I think we're not all that many people. Even if you just open up your microphone, you'll feel, well, I'm in the middle of a sentence, or if I'm at the end of the sentence, then it's a good place to make a comment or a question. So, if you hold up your hand or somehow signal, that'll be good during the discussion as well. Okay, I'm also going to just begin 3 or 4 sentences describing with a little bit more detail, not much more than what Rick did, what we've done in order to make the connection between what we've looked at until now and today's topic. So until now, we've talked about humanism in Moses Mendelssohn's understanding of Judaism as a religion of reason worthy of equality in an enlightened society. Modern humanism is just, it flows forth from almost each of those terms, right? He had to show that Judaism is a religion of reason, universal reason, equality, enlightened society. We saw the impact of modern humanism in Rabbi Nachman Krochmal's making of historical scholarship and an appreciation of the role played by the human spirit in the creation of scripture and later Jewish sources, like historical scholarship and the emphasis on the human spirit in the creation of religion. Kochman made that a part of traditional Jewish Torah study. So you see there the impact of humanism on Judaism and Jewish thought. We saw the impact of humanism in various aspects of Herzl's political and Achad Ha'am's cultural Zionism. Okay, and as Rick mentioned, though, today we're going to go in a slightly different tact. And today we're going to see a traditional and even Orthodox Jewish Torah scholar. And maybe I'll stop here for a moment because I'm just assuming that everybody knows what we're talking about when we use the word Torah. And it may be so, but I'll just mention anyway. When we use the word Torah in traditional Judaism, it means the divine law. It means the law by which the community lived. It means all the totality of Jewish teachings, or it might mean just the 5 books of Moses. But the study of Torah has been for maybe 1,000 years, maybe a little bit less, not much, maybe the central community ritual of Judaism is like learning the study of Torah was a tremendously high value. So the fellow that we're going to be studying today is a traditional, even Orthodox Torah scholar, but And here's the really fascinating thing where he ties into modern humanism. He identifies, his name is Rabbi Chaim Hershenson, right? And he identifies the biblical idea of covenant. Remember how central the idea of covenant is to the Bible. There's a covenant between the people and the Israelite people and God. There are covenants between the Israelite people, the different tribes. There are covenants between the Israelite people and other peoples, right? But just think about how central the idea of covenant is in biblical literature. So Hershenson sees the biblical idea of covenant. Think of Mount Sinai as a place where the covenant, I mean, that's all monotheistic tradition, where the covenant is first made with God on Mount Sinai. So Hershenson identifies the biblical idea of covenant with certain humanistic aspects of American constitutionalism. And as a result, and I'm going to go into talking about this for a moment, it's not all that surprising to find a common denominator between the biblical idea of covenant and American constitutionalism. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But first, what I want to say is that because Hershenson identifies or makes an identification, conflates maybe even certain ideas of American constitutionalism with the biblical notion of covenant, he ultimately understands the relation between the people of Israel and their ancient Torah, right? The Jewish law, the Torah by which the Jewish community lives, the law that's been given by God to the Jewish people, right? Hershenson understands that the relationship between the people of Israel and that law and their Torah as a relationship that exists between any people and their state or social constitution in a modern democracy, such as in the American democracy. So to make this simple, what's really fascinating about Hershenson is that he does see the Torah, right? The religious heritage, the law given to the Jewish people by God. He does see that as divine in some way, but its significance for the Jewish people, in his opinion, its power, its binding normative obligation, its obligatory power is only a result of it being the constitution that the people chose for himself. So even to simplify this a little bit more, right? Think of two possibilities. The question is, where did the Torah come from? Where did this thing that the Jewish people live by, this religious corpus and law that the Jewish people live by throughout the generations, where did it come from? And we know the debates in the time of modern humanism. The old answer was it came from God, and he gave it at Mount Sinai. And therefore, the Jewish people, even their court system, their way of life, the laws are all coming from God, and that's the authority. But there's another possibility, which is the possibility that we find in American democracy, and particularly in American constitutionalism. And that is that the people create, or at least adopt, their constitution, and without the people signing on to it, it has no force. Rabbi Chaim Hershenson developed two different but interrelated notions of covenant in the Bible, in the Torah, in the Jewish heritage. The first one, which you can find, let's say, in the stories concerning Abraham's family, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he calls a divine covenant. These family members and the individuals that made up this family took upon themselves, according to Hershon, to enter into an agreement, a covenant with God. God would take care of them, but God had his demands, and they entered the covenant, and they had there's this thing called the covenant through the parts, in which and there's the circumcision that Abraham went through. This is a covenant. It's a divine covenant between Abraham or Abraham's family and their personal God. But then there's another kind of covenant that's in the Bible, according to Hershon, the kind you find in the story of Mount Sinai, where God comes down on a mountain and he wants to give over his law. But the Bible says that when the people heard it, they used the words in Hebrew, na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will hear. And Hershon says, which means that God's Torah, God's teachings, would not be incumbent legally upon the Jewish people until they already entered into a covenant between them and decided among them to make God's law their national constitution. That's pretty much the parameters of Hershon's thought. And here you can see how the potential for this kind of thinking is already there in the Bible, but he's being very influenced by the notion of the people and the people as sovereign in a democracy, and once again, particularly in American constitutionalism. So with that, I'm just now going to give you a few moments of a very short biography to know what the worlds are that Hershon is coming from and who the people are that he's talking to. And then finally, I want to say a word about the connection between the biblical heritage and the Enlightenment, which also informed American constitutionalism. And then we have everything we need to go to the texts. And we should be able to do this in the time allotted to us. So just who is this guy, Rabbi Chaim Hershon? Very few people know about him today. He was once much more well-known, we won't go into the reasons why. He's becoming well-known among Israeli scholars and Jewish thought again. But Rabbi Chaim Hershon was born actually, surprisingly, in the land of Israel in the 1850s. And this is at a time to an East European Jewish family at a time when almost nobody was emigrating to the land of Israel. This family did. And he was taught Torah. His entire education was a traditional Torah education taught by his father because he lived in Tzfat. And there was no real education there. In Jerusalem, there was a really severe old school education, we'll call it. In any event, and he became a rabbi, and he was trained to be a Torah scholar, but he was also eventually run out of the land of Israel by the very, very arch conservative, ultra-Orthodox, old world Jewish community. It's hard to describe. It's a sociological thing. Probably the most arch conservative Jewish community in the world at that time, and they prevented him from getting work teaching. So he, in order to avoid poverty, actually he already reached poverty, a certain amount of maybe on the verge of starvation, and so he emigrated to the United States around 1900, and there he became a rabbi in Hoboken, New Jersey, and was also very active and very well known on the Lower East Side and in rabbinical circles. And I guess that's enough as far as background. So I see a quote here. Somebody mentioned a comment that my picture has been frozen. So I'm wondering if anybody else is having problems. I see that even for myself, my picture is frozen.
But we can hear you fine. We just have a
I don't know. Okay, so should we just continue this way?
I think so. I think so.
Okay, very good. So let's do that. Okay, so I think that's enough biography. What you should know is that because Hershon was not trained in any official formal yeshiva of the Orthodox or the ultra-Orthodox. He was more flexible and liberal than many ultra-Orthodox thinkers of his time. And that's enough about his biography to help us that we'll need. The only couple of points that I would like to go into now is to just say a few things about the connection between American constitutionalism and the Enlightenment and modern humanism, because all these things are tied together. So here, for our purposes, it's important to remember, and I'm sure this is something that most, if not all of you already know, that the founders of American democracy were students of the European Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. And the principles of the Enlightenment and the principles of universal humanism, equality, right, all the things that we mentioned, are really powerfully echoed both in the American Declaration of Independence and in the structure of government and the principles of the American Constitution. That's number one. Number two, it's not surprising to find common principles in the Bible and modern political and judicial thought, particularly going back to the Enlightenment. Of course, but including American constitutionalism. And remember, the American Constitution was written around toward the end of the 18th century Enlightenment. And it's an Enlightenment document. So, but the reason that it's not surprising to find commonalities with the Bible is because so many Enlightenment thinkers, including many of the founding fathers of the United States, were so well versed in the Bible and actually saw themselves as students in the Bible. And therefore we think that where Hershenson just presumed that the American constitutionalism has its right and uses that to interpret the Bible and to interpret rabbinical literature, there's actually a basis for that. It's not entirely forced, while the historical and biographical influence is clear. So now we'll go to texts. Let me stop first. Any questions or comments until now? I see not. So we'll go ahead. Now I want you all to take a breath and realize that now we're going to learn a different kind of text than we've learned until now, and totally different than anything I could say in a background lecture the way I did until this moment. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to learn 3 short rabbinical texts that Hershenson builds his discussion on. And it's very good, since Hershenson himself is such a traditional Torah scholar, he presumes that people reading him already know these texts. He quotes from them, but doesn't go into them. So I think for our purposes, we'll take these 3 rabbinical texts, early rabbinical texts, Talmudic texts, and know that this is what Hershenson had in mind before he even started writing. So I'm going to ask a question. I don't know if I'm going to get an answer, but can everybody see the text, have the text in front of you? And you see that the first text, you can ignore the Hebrew, right? And we'll go right to the English translation. Do you see where the first words are, should the court make a ruling? I'm assuming everybody has it, I guess. Okay. So
it might be worth sharing the document.
Excuse me?
It might be worth sharing the document.
Yeah, I don't know how to do that. I'm sorry. But you can do that, I think, right, Rick?
I'll give it a try. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I'll wait a half a moment. Let's see what happens.
Okay, I've got it here.
Okay, I'm assuming that everybody has it, and I'll give my, the leeway, the segue into that in any event.
How's that?
Yeah, very good, very good. Okay, so this first text is very interesting because it's actually a text that talks about what do you do when the court makes a mistake, which is already different, and it's from the Talmud, early rabbinical literature, very different than what we normally think in, let's say, traditional or Orthodox Judaism today, that the court can't make a mistake because they represent God.
Mhm.
The way to, so what happened now? Let's read the text. Perhaps one more thing to add here, because some of you may have the familiarity with the Bible. In the Bible, in the book of Leviticus, there's a line that says, and if the word, meaning the word of God, is disappears, ne'elam, somehow it disappears from the people, they don't know what God wants from them, right? Then there's a certain sacrifice they have to bring, right? They didn't know, they sinned by mistake, they have to bring a sacrifice. In the time of the rabbis, it was presumed that it's because of the rabbinical court that the people sinned, right? Because like there's no prophecy at the time of the rabbis. They don't believe that there's prophecy in their time. And the only way to know what God wants of them is from their learning. So if the people made a mistake, it's because the court made a mistake. Now let's go read what the Talmud says about that. What do you do when the court makes a mistake? And the text says, should the court make a ruling whose implementation would cause a transgression regarding any of the commandments, and an individual thereby went along and unintentionally sinned in accordance with that ruling, that individual is free of guilt because, and the Talmud says, the Mishnah, it's the earlier part of the Talmud, says, why? Because he is dependent on the court. He uses a term, talui beveit din. He is dependent on the court, which is a great way, normative way, legalistic way of writing, but describing the function of the court. The individuals in society are dependent upon the court's teachings. And if the court makes a mistake, so here the Mishnah is saying the individual is not held responsible because the court told him to do it. So then the question is, I'll just read the next line. Should the court make such a ruling and one of them knew that it was mistaken, or he himself, this person is a Torah sage, that person is guilty because he is not dependent upon the court. So it's really a great way of describing the function of the court. The people are dependent upon the court to know God's law. So if the court makes a mistake and as a result you sin, you're not responsible. But if you're a wise person, a Torah scholar, and know that the court is wrong and you follow the court, then you're guilty because you still should know better. Why did I bring this text? All in all, first of all, because Hershenson bases himself on this. This is his understanding as to responsibility of the courts in Judaism, and therefore the courts should be very careful in their teachings. Society is dependent upon them, but he's also very interested in human autonomy and individual autonomy. Hershenson, even though he was traditional and orthodox, couldn't stand the idea, and his humanism comes out, he couldn't stand the idea that the rabbis had the ability or the right to force the Torah or their interpretation of the Torah on anybody, and he wanted individual Jews to use their own minds to try to understand the truth. All in all, if you would like to give a heading to this text, even though it's normative, it only talks about what do you do in such a situation, it teaches something very interesting. It teaches the Talmud's position, or at least one of its major positions, concerning what you do in a conflict between truth and tradition. For instance, if the court is basing itself on knowledge or the tradition might be faulty. But the student or the individual and the court itself is really expected, when possible, to ascertain the truth, right? To try ask, what is it really that God is asking of me in this? And it can make a mistake. So the whole situation of the religious courts, rabbinical courts, in the Talmud and for Hirshenson is to maintain that tension, to mediate between the authority of tradition that the courts will very often go to, certainly in a case of doubt, and the critical idea of truth, always asking, is this really the right ruling? Is this really what God wants? And finally, with respect to this, although it's not mentioned here, you can see how this text can already make a difference if you consider the people sovereign the way that Hirshenson does, meaning consider that it's the people, if you consider that it's the people that make God's law into their, let's say, constitution, then the people have to have a way of questioning and criticizing the courts. Here, at least, the ultimate value is you, in any event, should search for truth. And even if the court says you're allowed to do something and you know you're not allowed, you shouldn't do it. Okay, and that's it. I think we learned what we needed from this text, and we can go on to the next one. Each of these texts actually form one part of the whole picture. Okay, now there's another Mishnah, the older part of the Talmud, that comes from the same period of time as the one we just read. It's from a different part of the Talmud, but it's from the same period of time. And here it has an interesting question. The Talmud already taught, and even the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, already taught that in order to decide the law in a court, and by the way, when we're talking about court, we're usually talking about what's called the Sanhedrin, what would have been ancient Israel's Supreme Court. It's hard to know what's historical and what's anachronistic, but it's like an ancient Israel Supreme Court. And the rule was given that in order to make a decision, the way you do in the American courts, you go through all the judges and the majority opinion wins. So now the Mishnah, that early part of the Talmud, asks a question and says, if the law is always in accordance with the majority opinion, why do we recall the minority opinion as well? And I imagine you can ask that question in the context of American constitutionalism or American law. But anyway, it was an ancient Jewish law that you record the minority opinion. And now this Mishnah is asking us why, if the decision is according to the majority. And look at the answer. Here you're beginning to see the beginning of a concept that looks almost like judicial review, like where the courts, later courts even can review earlier precedent or review the positive law and say whether it's constitutional or not. This here would be more similar to a common law system than the American Constitution. But look at the answer that this Mishnah gives in why it is necessary to record the minority opinion if the majority, excuse me, is what determines the ruling. The answer? This is because there may be a court, of course we have to fill in the future, that will agree with the minority opinion and will want to cite this opinion as an authority. For no court may reject the opinion of an earlier court unless it is greater in wisdom and in number. And a very simple story to put it in our language, there seems to be a rule here. This is the way it is, I guess, in the United States, in American courts, right? No lower court can contradict the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can contradict, can change, overturn the ruling of a lower court. But in this Mishnah, according to the ancient Jewish law, even a court that is not a superior court, right? The terms that he uses, what would the upper court, the Supreme Court, how would it be described here? A court that is greater in wisdom and in number than the other courts. When you have a court that's greater in wisdom and number, according to the Mishnah, that court doesn't need anything in order to overturn earlier rulings. But if it's on the same status of wisdom, and it's the same size court, let's say with only 3 judges or only 1 judge, right? You can't go against an earlier ruling unless you have something to stand on. What do you have to stand on? The minority opinion in that earlier ruling. Here too, you can get a sense as to the tension between the search for truth and the authority of tradition. And once again, for Hirschenson, this is all a part of the people having a say in what otherwise would be considered a divine judicial process. The people have a say. And there's a common denominator between this text and the previous text in the notion which is very rarely learned today in traditional and Orthodox circles, that the court can be wrong. The religious leadership can be wrong. There are historical dynamics. There are going to be reasons that you're going to have to overturn a position. And just to fill out this, I won't go any broader than this. Rick, we have the next text? Okay. The next text we'll read very quickly because it just says it reviews what was said in the previous one, but adds a good definition that we'll be able to use. Remember this distinction. Hirschenson distinguishes between 2 different kinds of courts. I think it might correspond somehow to the different type of covenants we talked about earlier, but we won't go into that either. What are the 2 different kinds of courts for Hirschenson? It goes with tradition. One court decides according to the already accepted rulings. What's the other court? The court that decides according to its own reason. It also, you can think of a lot of distinctions here, but let's read the text, it'll become clear. From what we just learned concerning the question, why do we recall the position of the minority when it's the majority? The ruling is always according to the majority. So now Hirschenson is going to broaden what he learns from this concept and says, we learn from this that whenever there is a dissenting opinion, notice, a court that rules according to precedent must follow the majority. And even though in a situation of extenuating circumstances, it may follow the dissenting opinion, right? So generally speaking, we go according to tradition, and that usually means we follow the minority. But if circumstances have changed and you have to change the law, it's enough for the other later, weaker, smaller court to base itself on the previous minority ruling. But that's for a court that goes according to tradition usually. But a court that rules in the light of its own reason, I mean, he says, let's not even look at the precedents yet. Let's consider the situation and ask possibly what could it be that God wants of us in this situation. This kind of court is never obligated to go according to the majority of the previous court. It may always follow the dissenting opinion, even without extenuating circumstances, meaning that a court that by definition follows its reason and is always looking for truth can always overturn another court's decision. But if there was no dissenting opinion, then, right, provided there's a dissenting opinion, but if not, then you can't even use your reason here and you're still obligated by tradition. I realize that for people not familiar with this material, there's a lot of detail here. So notice that what Hershenson is doing as he's talking about the court system, one thing is that he's delimiting the ascription of truth to the courts, right? If the court made a mistake, you have to go against the court, at least not if it's in a permission, right? If they say you're permitted, they made a mistake, don't do it anyway, go against the court. That's one thing, the search for truth as opposed to tradition. Second, against regarding the court, right? There's a dynamic. Courts can overturn each other. Again, back to the tension between truth and tradition. And Hershenson clearly gives room for tradition. Tradition, the fact that we made a covenant and there is such a judicial system is imperative. Without that, society is lawless and godless. But it's not God who gives the authority, even though there is a judicial system that runs according to the Torah. It's dynamic. It changes its understanding with time as to what God wanted from you, and that's why but in order to maintain the tension, nonetheless, we still have to limit it to change when there is already a differing position that allow it, because otherwise you would just be destroying the system, apparently, for these texts. And Hershenson goes with these. Okay, Rick, last one. And here's the most important text, I think, of these. Yes. Now we're going to ask, so we understand that Hershenson is a Torah scholar and he spends his life learning the Torah, learning the Bible, learning the rabbis, and also trying to make sense of the present from out of these ancient sources. And so we know Hershenson spent time trying to understand these Talmudic texts. Now we're going to see what Hershenson does with the learning that he acquired as a scholar. What does he do as a rabbi, perhaps Jewish philosopher, let's say in the first decades of the 20th century when the world is changing, Zionism came into, and here's the thing you should know. The reason Hershenson went into this stuff, it was because he was one of the founders of religious Zionism, and he saw as his goal the founding of a modern democratic Jewish state based on Jewish law, from coming back from the Torah and the Talmud. How is that possible? That's why he went into this learning, into the scholarship. And now we're going to read a pretty short paragraph in which Hershenson is going to tell us what he learned from all this. And once again, you can imagine Hershenson, an Orthodox Jew, standing opposed to many ultra-Orthodox Jews of his time who are anti-Zionist, anti-modern, anti-humanist, and comes along and who maintain we follow the Torah because God commanded us at Mount Sinai, and that's all. What does Hershenson learn from these texts to oppose that position? Watch. God does not tyrannize his creatures. Excuse the typos. And notice the word tyrannize. He wrote it in Hebrew, but used the word tirunia, and I have no doubt about it that he's using the word tyranny because of the impact that it left, that the statements, proclamations against tyranny at the founding of the American state left upon him, and realize that there's a parallel between God's tyranny and, you might say, King George III's tyranny at the time of the American Revolution. At any point, this is his point. God does not tyrannize his creatures. He's not a tyrant. nor does he force them to do his bidding until they themselves willfully chose to enter into a covenant with him at Sinai. That's the people's covenant, not the divine covenant. I'm sorry. At Sinai, there was both a people's covenant and the divine covenant. We're going to see that the people's covenant has to come first, right? So God is not a tyrant. He does not force himself upon his people or his desire upon their people until they themselves willfully chose to enter into a covenant with him at Sinai and at the fields of Moab. Won't go into why he mentions that. And notice, from the word covenant to contract, he uses the word brit, covenant, and contract is chozah, almost as interchangeable. This contract is central with regard to all commandments. The people were ordered to appoint their elders and their judges, right? There's in Deuteronomy, and thou shalt appoint elders and judges, and you shall go to them with your questions in every generation. So the Torah that God gave at Sinai orders the people to appoint elders and their judges, notice, only after they willfully entered into a covenant with God. That God didn't order them to appoint rabbis or judges until after they said, we will hear and we will do, meaning until they voluntarily entered into this covenant with God. And here he says explicitly, as with any constitution, he's talking about the Torah that God commanded at Mount Sinai, and he says, as with any constitution, the judges. And now when he says judges, because the Bible talks about judges, you have to hear rabbis, because the biblical judges from the Talmudic period on are rabbis. So you can read it that way too. It says, and as with any constitution, the judges, in parentheses, the rabbis, are indeed charged with its safekeeping. The job of the rabbis is not to force God's Torah on the people, but rather to keep and maintain God's Torah the way judges keep and maintain the Constitution and the judicial culture that follows from it. But this, Hershonson continues, of course, it once again is only after its approval by the people at large. Wow, it's even in the popular democracy. It's only after the Constitution has been approved by the people at large are the rabbis then appointed in order to maintain and keep the Torah, which, by the way, if we take the example of the American Constitution, necessarily requires both liberal judicial review and a conservative attempt in order to make decisions based on precedent. Once again, if you have only judicial review, then every generation creates a new constitution. If you have no judicial review and only precedent, then it's the same thing as God being a tyrant, or the courts or the legislator being a tyrant and forcing the thing on you. This is an incredible statement in any event by Hershonson, to say that God ordered you to appoint judges only after the Torah as a constitution was approved by the people at large. And note the power of approval, because at Sinai it says Na'aseh v'nishma, we will hear and we will do. The power of approval, according to Hershonson, was not only for our initial acceptance of the Torah, but for all time, meaning that this is the way the system works. It wasn't a one-time thing. And if you want to just know an example of where for Hershonson, the people have to ratify constitutional amendments of the Torah. So there's a great, great story in the Talmud that says, the Bible says that at every 6 years in the sabbatical year, all debts are canceled. And so the rich people stopped lending money to poor people because they knew they wouldn't get their money back. And so Hillel, the great sage, decided that you can't have a situation where the poor people can't get a loan. So he did away with this biblical commandment that says to nullify all loans in the sabbatical year after 6 years. How did Hillel take upon himself in order to go against a biblical injunction? Hirschenson says, oh, it's very easy, because he was a sage, he's one of these judges, he's one of these rabbis who are in charge with the keeping of the system. And he says there, and it's not only when the Torah made these laws at Mount Sinai that the people had to ratify, but the representatives of the people in the courts still have to ratify later on, so that if something in the Constitution or the Torah becomes a problem, then these wise judges should know how to correct the problem. How did Hillel did that? He didn't really go against the Bible. What he said is that all loans to poor people made by private people are canceled. But the return of loans, therefore, is not necessary to the private people, but then it was obligated to have the people who took the loans to return the loans to the court, which is the same administration of the people, the representation of the people through the judges that founded the system at Sinai, and the court gave back the money to the people who lent it. But here we have an example as to how the founding of the necessity to ratify the Constitution, because if the people don't ratify it, it's not a covenant, right? If the people don't ratify it, then it's still just a covenant between God and Abraham's family. It doesn't become the constitution of an entire society. And that is, according to Hirschenson, what the Jewish legal system and the rabbinical legal system in Jewish law is intended to do. If you want to give a nice kind of picture, if you want a kind of like summary of the entire picture, you can take a look at it like this. Coming from Jewish tradition, coming from the Bible, of course, there's a founding of a religious legal system. The rabbis found themselves in a situation that anybody who has, in any society that already has an ancient law, will find itself in. What do we do with this ancient law? How can we live according to it? In the earlier biblical period, an answer that could have been given to this was that, well, the prophets will tell us. Moses was a prophet, Isaiah was a prophet, and God talks to them. In the Talmudic period, it was assumed that there was no prophecy. So who's going to deal with how should we implement the divine law in a totally different civilization? You got to realize the Roman civilization at the turn of the millennium was nothing like the early agricultural Canaanite civilization that the early Israelites grew out of. So what do? The rabbis were brilliant. They set up a scheme with 3 tiers. The upper tier and the lower tier are already there in the Bible. God commanding and the people listening. But what do you do in the middle where the prophets used to be? That's the function of the courts. How do the courts know the teachings of God? Through the learning of ancient texts. But the important thing is here, now I'm going to jump to Hirschenson, is that Hirschenson realized that in the rules that these rabbis created for themselves, there is an echo of the voice of the people, and particularly a voice of the people looking for reason in a certain tension with the traditions of the past. So now courts represent God in making, in explaining the commands, but bear responsibility if they're wrong, and individuals bear responsibility for themselves if they know better. Hirschenson then makes the distinction between a court that rules by precedent and a court that rules by its search for the truth. So we went into this. the ultimate picture for Hershelson is that in all of these things, there's no difference between the rule of law in Judaism's Torah or the rule of the Constitution in any modern Republican Democratic constitution. There are, although even he doesn't emphasize, there are two differences. One is obvious, that here the legislators, the initial legislator, are the courts who are asking what it is that God wants of us, whereas but in both cases, whereas in American courts, it's the flesh and blood legislature without any real turning to God. And two, and this is very a big difference, in that in the modern system of government, at least the American system of government, the independence of the different branches of government is such that there's an independent legislature and an independent court, and the courts have judicial review, let's say. But in the ancient Jewish system, the courts were both legislator and court, the courts who interpretation of the law, creation of the law and interpretation of the law. And ultimately, in what way does this portray a very, very humanistic orientation in the Talmudic learning of this Orthodox Jew? All you have to do is say, what's more central in his understanding of Jewish law in the past and the present? Is God more central, or is the relationship between society and its legislating and reviewing courts? And it's clear that the human is more central, even though the source, the origins, it may have been in the Abrahamic covenant with God. And I think I'll stop there. Any questions or comments?
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
First thing, to go back to, both of them deal with some of your initial points. How do you compare the democratic concept of a social compact with the way Hershenson's interpreting the divine covenant or the human covenant at that time?
Okay, yeah, I think it's pretty clear. So how is the Torah context where divinity is present? How can both that and what we know as social contract in modern thought, modern philosophy, modern political thought, you're asking how both of those can be considered democratic?
Well,
where it seems that
okay,
where it seems that God being involved would make it non-democratic. So that's exactly the point. If I actually want to continue with this, and I'm sure that this is what Hershenson was going for, even in modern Enlightenment political theory, social contract theory, for many of those individual philosophers, and certainly the societies they were part of, the legislatures or the law in general, in their own minds, is still looking to God as a symbol of the good and the ought. The brilliance is that because it's during the Enlightenment and continues later on, is that even when God remains a symbol of the good, of the ought, of the right, of truth, of all the ideals that society should be yearning for, right, as a symbol, the apparatus of government, of legislation, and the way the legal system works divorces the mechanics of government from the personality or the being of God. And here it's purely humanist, it's purely human, and it's acknowledged to be so. I think that Hirschenson is trying to portray Judaism in the same way, except that here, because Judaism did not go through the Enlightenment in a way that modern Jewish thought, for obvious reasons, until Zionism, did not include political thought. And so what Hirschenson is, that is because of Zionism that he's going into this thought. And it seems to be that what Hirschenson is trying to do is saying, yes, of course, after all these years, we're Jews and we're the Jewish people because our Torah, and we all have this image of God being above and all of us being an extension of having been in Mount Sinai. All of that's part of the Jewish mythology, and Hirschenson doesn't want to change it. But what he is doing nonetheless is you can believe all that and yet still accept the fact that the Torah is only obligatory because the Jewish people ratified it as their constitution, and that made the Jewish people and their representatives as much of an authority as the original text supposedly given directly by God. So ultimately, it's democratic in the same way. So what he wanted to do, he wanted what we have as the Knesset, the parliament in Israel. He wanted that to be called the Sanhedrin and yet run like a modern democratic parliament, and relying on the words of the Bible that says, and thou shalt choose judges and policemen, shotrim v'shoftim v'shotrim, judges and police and enforcers of the law. You have to choose them. It's democratic. He's making God into a symbol. He's not making God the legislature, and he's not making courts the legislature in God's name. God is the symbol of the idea, while it's the human courts ruled by majority. Now, since you asked, if you don't mind, I'm just going to put one more point on that because it's really super important. In Jewish law, going back to the Talmud, when the courts decide a case, there are two phases. One is in which all of the scholars, the judges, discuss the law, and everybody gives their opinion. And their Hirschenson says you're allowed to act only according to the principle of truth. Nobody is allowed to change his opinion because that was the other guy's opinion. Everybody goes according to, but when it comes to deciding the law, the majority goes. Even if you're and then that obligates, even if you think that their reasoning was wrong. Just like the American Supreme Court in the end. Once again, there's no division here between legislature and court, but the majority rules, and the judges here are seen as representatives of the people. That's the point.
Thank you. Elliot, go ahead.
I have two questions. Since it's after 11 o'clock, it could possibly change the topic just a little bit. One is, can you explain what's happening in the courts today in Israel? The tremendous civil unrest.
Yeah. I obviously won't say much about what's going on in Israel because that'll take this weekend, next week, and it's a very bad situation.
And I have another question after you finish.
Okay, so let me do this. But I do think it's relevant to what we're talking about, and I'll tell you why. In my opinion, first of all, what's going on in Israel, it's very important to see, is that very, very often I would say is that there's been a process over a number of decades now in which what used to be the synthesis of Jewish particularism and universal humanism in Zionism separated and became the catchwords for two different opposing political camps. This can be described in other ways too, but this is a major thing. It has to do with whether you come from a traditional community, whether you come from a totally secular community. There are reasons why the political divide has erupted the way it does. Why is the court so central? That's why where your question is relevant. And here I think there's a tremendous paradox. When you look at the two, let's say the coalition and the opposition in Israel today, the coalition in its rhetoric talks much more about the emphasis on Israel as the Jewish state, right? The opposition talks much more about Israel as a democracy. Of course, to make any sense of Israel, it Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. Otherwise, it makes no sense or whatever. But this is what happened. The paradox is that since we think about Jewish particularity, our own Jewish identities, in terms of what's good for us, what we personally identify with, the Supreme Court, that more often than not judges by universal values in areas of security, in areas of work immigration, all different areas, has decided against the opinion. It happens in the United States against the opinions, let's say, the particularistic characteristics of the right, I would say. And it's gone so far in terms of the legislation that the present government is now creating, and all the legislation is designed at making the courts having, I'll put it gently, the government, the coalition having more influence in the courts than it does now, much more. But I don't want to get into that debate. What I do want to say is what the paradox is. The paradox is that when you're thinking about Jewish particularity, you actually might want the government to be more powerful and the court less powerful. But if you're talking about Hershensen's understanding of how the Jewish legal system works, which is the one in which every generation, like other constitutional systems, you have to have courts who fulfill partially the job of the prophets, to look above the government, to look above the coalition, to look for an ideal truth that you might even call a divine truth, even though it's not obligatory until everybody agreed upon. So I think that's the relevance for Hershenson to what's going today. He shows how in opposition to people's intuitive associations, how the independent court is absolutely necessary, right, in regard to the state, is absolutely necessary for the thriving of Judaism and of a Jewish society, and also for an ethical and social and democratic society. Second question, you had two questions there.
Yeah, it's only because it's after time and it's a totally different topic. But can you explain the concept of divorce and the court's role in divorce?
It's very simple. It's very simple. First of all, anything that has to do the state of Israel, probably to avoid problems that should not have been avoided, adopted what was already in existence from the British, meaning that all things that have to do with family law are relegated to the religious authorities of each of the different religions in Israel. So that among Jews, divorce, things that have to do with divorce are decided by the rabbinate, and there are very strict rules. At least, first of all, technically they can be gotten around through procedure, but it's the man who has to give the document to the woman, and it's basically anybody that hasn't had an official divorce recognized by the rabbinical courts in Israel can't get married. That's basically the situation.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
I had another question, and it might take us even further away. But in the U.S., Christian nationalists have been using the concept of Judeo-Christian values as a way of seeking support for the types of positions and legislation and public policy that they support. To what degree does this come from the Hershenson's view of
no relation? The term Judeo-Christian, first of all, I don't know if the term even really existed before the end of the 19th century in the United States. But the concept, the phenomenon, clearly existed already in Central Europe during the 19th century. And the concept of Judeo-Christian heritage is pretty much just echoes the historical reality that Christianity in the West grew out of a meeting between Western paganism and biblical religion, right? And in that sense, there's already, okay, so now when we get to the period of modernity, right? And modernity is they're talking about equality among different peoples in opposition to the second-class status of Jews beforehand, now among European liberals, and certainly in the United States, once there are millions of Jews actually emigrating to the United States, American liberals as well are now talking about the reality. You can't talk about our society any longer as a Christian society as though it's only a Christian heritage. It's a biblical heritage. It's the Western biblical heritage, which is Western and which is Christian and Jewish. And I think that's all it means by the Judeo-Christian heritage. The problem that I have with the term is not intrinsic and it has nothing to do with anybody using it, except that it's a term that can only encompass diaspora Jewry. It can't encompass Israeli Jewry. The reason it can encompass diaspora Jewish, because even the Judaism of most diaspora Jews is a Judaism that's formed by the Western, American, European, or whatever civilizational reality. And we have to, I mean, I don't think it can be denied that in most individual Jews' experience of being Jewish includes the mediation of the non-Jewish world, right? That actually, and not only the non-Jewish world, of the Christian world, I would say. It's true because in Israel too, because of the internet, or because of long-term connections. But in Israel, there is actually, I think, a Jewish heritage that doesn't require the Christian West in order for it to be understood, to be relevant, or to be lived in Israel. Like there is, a consistent Jewish historical heritage, the way in the West there is a consistent, or a few consistent Christian religious heritages. So that's the way I relate to the term of Judeo-Christian heritage. And there are those who have problem with the term for other reasons, but without any more guidance as to what you're looking for, I guess that would fill it.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I don't see any other questions,
Okay.
but we appreciate your time today. And I know next week we'll be back live in the Oak Room. So hope
Right. And just so, and these last two sessions are going to do with humanistic and justice-oriented interpretations of the Sabbath among surprising thinkers. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor Turner.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.